Durham University is launching a new scholarship scheme to support UK students of black heritage to study English literature, where their financial circumstances may be a barrier to them accessing higher education. The scholarship will be available to one undergraduate per intake who will receive £4,000 annually for a minimum of 3 years during their time at the university. Jeremy Vine is a UK journalist, broadcaster, and apparently he also has a relatively popular radio programme somewhere, but we wouldn't know anything about that. And Jeremy has donated £120,000 to make the bursary possible, and he joins me over Zoom. Good morning, Jeremy.
Hi, lovely to talk to you.
Thanks so much for coming on Durham OnAir. We know you're a very, very busy man. So you graduated from Durham with a degree in English literature in 1986. Do you remember your time in Durham with fond memories?
Oh, hugely. I mean, I think it's going back quite a long way. The Smiths were the key band between 83 and 86, and I think the Durham Cathedral had just been finished when I was at university. So, I have incredibly fond memories. And in a way, they've only got fonder over the years. I realised how lucky I was.
Do you manage to get back at all?
I've been back quite a bit, yeah. At first, I was resistant because the first time you go back after you spent your whole life there for 3 years, it's a bit traumatic because you suddenly realise everyone's younger than you.
Sure.
But I've now got children who are older than the students there. So to be honest, that ship has sailed. And I love to go back and make connections with the new generation of lecturers and students and see the culture and all that. I love the city and I love the university.
It's a very different place now, I imagine, to how it was in 85, 86. But it's a wonderful city, and my work takes me all over the place, but I'm always going to champion it. What made you want to attend Durham at the time then? Do you remember what it was about the place or the university in particular that made you kind of go, yep, this is the place?
Actually, I just led quite a sheltered life, so I didn't really have any clue as to where I wanted to go or what I wanted to do. Sure. I decided I didn't want to take Oxbridge because I was just kind of cross about going back to school after having done A-levels. So my dad said, well, what about going to Durham because I hear it's good. And when I looked it up, it was the number 3, number 4. I think it's probably still there, actually. So it's the first university after Oxbridge. I think these days Exeter's very high and Bristol and so on. Durham is still pulling its weight. But I knew nothing about the city except that during the 80s, it was absolutely the center of the whole miners' strike, the country was in turmoil, which is a real cultural thing for me because I was brought up in Cheam in Surrey. It's the word boring is not always negative, but it was a boring suburb of London. It was in London's shadow. Nothing happened there. There are no beautiful buildings. There's just one beautiful building, actually. Durham has beautiful buildings all over the place, and a different culture and a different accent and different sky and weather and a river. And the whole thing was such an eye-opener. It just blew me away.
And Cheam's probably about as far away from the miners' strike as you could possibly get, really, in terms of politics.
You are so right.
Yeah.
So my mum thought that I was going into the centre of some sort of battle zone. And she just said, for goodness sake, be careful, Jeremy. But for me, it was an education because I was understanding that, other lives. You've got to appreciate. It's a big thing about journalism is realizing that you usually find you look at your life and you analyze it and you find you're not typical. You're the unusual one.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing about Durham is we're either a miner or a ballet dancer. That's what we do. So tell us a little bit about the bursary. How's it going to work, and what's the idea behind the bursary?
Well, I've got a friend called Joel Donovan who I was a student with, and we've been mates for years since Durham, and he went into law. And he just told me that we were just talking and he said he'd done this thing with a law bursary, and he found it very satisfying, the idea that there may be students in the future who've got the Joel Donovan law bursary and actually might not have been able to come to the university without it. And I said, that's brilliant, John. We were just talking about it. And he said, look, I tell you what, I'll put you in touch with the woman at Durham University, the official who helped him put it together. And this is a woman called Claire Malloy, who's absolute hero of the university. And we had lots of conversations about it. And she gave, it wasn't really a copy and paste from Joel's, but it was very similar in terms of trying to find students in ethnic minorities who might not otherwise be able to go. So I suppose this will sound a bit crass, but it's the kind of student I didn't really see in the 80s when I was at Durham. Because when I look back, I'm very conscious that it was a privileged place to be. And I think the students didn't understand in the 80s that we were probably there more through luck than talent. And obviously the great surge of university thinking in the last 30, 40 years is to try to change that. And I'm fully supportive of that. So I'm just hopeful that someone somewhere at some point gets to the university. It might only be one person, who couldn't have otherwise gone, and I'll be really chuffed, and it will have been worth it.
And I suppose for anybody listening to this who has a slight habit of being cynical about these things, when you attend a university such as Durham, or even if you just walk around Durham at term time, it doesn't take a lot of work to work out that there is a disparity about your background and what gets you into one of the top universities, whether that's Oxford, Cambridge, Durham. And you saying there you did notice a disparity in the 80s. I imagine through your talk show on Radio 2 and also through the TV show that you present, I imagine this topic has come up before. In your experience of talking about this, has the playing ground, has it leveled in recent decades? Has it become easier for people from black and ethnic minority backgrounds to get into those top universities, or is it still very much the same as it was in the 80s? Is it moving in the right direction?
Well, gosh, I sense you treading carefully with that question, and I mean, all I can say is that in the 80s, I think it was just really monochrome, the university, yeah. and it was very white, and it was very middle class.
Essentially, it was rare to see anybody who didn't have a white face at that university.
Yeah, yes, that's true. But I mean, that's not the only thing. I think it was. I went to public school, and I was. Only later in life do you think, my goodness, you think you've achieved stuff on your own volition, and then you realize that a lot of it's been handed to you, and it's the key part of understanding your life is to realize how lucky you were. And obviously we don't want people getting into Durham because of luck of birth. We want them to get in because they're the best students and they're talented and hungry for education and all that. And I think that's where diversity comes in, because you haven't got the best students if they all look and sound the same, if they've all got triple-barreled names. But I'm not, there still will be many posh students, and I think this anti-posh thing I don't really like. It's a massive university, and it can become diverse without hitting at any one particular group. I just think in the 80s it hadn't woken up to that. It certainly has now. I wouldn't want to judge it now, because I bet that if I talked to one of the leaders of the university, they would have amazing figures on access, because that's what this is all about. But it's in the end, we know how privilege works. We know that people with money tend to be able to confer privilege onto the next generation, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But to work against it is difficult and yet worth doing.
I don't know if you've come across this issue recently, but the big thing that we've been speaking about over the last 2 academic years, especially with students who listen to the programme, is the issue of accommodation. I mean, we had students at Durham sleeping out on the street near the Student Union the night before the accommodation offices and the estate agents opened, just to make sure that they could get affordable accommodation. It's such a shame that the idea of somebody who's got the grades, passed their A-levels with the grades that they wanted, received an offer from Durham and achieved the qualifications, can't come because they can't afford a house, or they're having to live 6 or 7 miles away or closer towards Newcastle, and they just can't afford to come. So will this bursary be able to go towards that kind of stuff? Will it be able to break down any barrier in terms of financial? How is it going to work with the kind of student and the university deciding how that money is spent, or are those finer details yet to be kind of put together?
I hope it will help with that, but I think the problem you described is a market problem, and it's really tricky. This, when I was at Durham, you'll laugh, but there were 6,000 students. Wow. Somebody recently told me there were 20,000. I don't know. It doesn't sound true, so I need to check that figure. But if that is true, that explains everything, doesn't it? That explains why colleges just can't keep you beyond a single year. Why, as you say, there's people sleeping outside estate agents and all that. And of course, then the market then forces the rents up. And the problem is that the university's expanded, but the accommodation hasn't. Yeah. And I think there's such a big job of work that needs to be done there. I guess the university probably needs to start thinking about building some tower blocks or whatever for students to live in. So they need to do something. Yeah, because you can't have students stressing about not being able to afford a place to live. And I also think that part of the Durham experience, I actually lived in, so I was in Hatfield for 3 years. Yeah. Because the default, strangely, in the 80s, the default was that unless you did something really proactive, you would simply be in college accommodation the next year. So it was the other way round. The college didn't have, if they let all the students go, they had no income from people in the rooms. So believe it or not, being just hopelessly indolent, I just let it go. And I ended up in college for 3 years. Now you'd never be able to do that because the colleges are full to bursting. And I went round with my daughter when she was looking at universities, and we went into Castle. And it's true, it's the most beautiful setting. But there were 2 students per room, and they were, some of them had a kind of one of those shower curtains, giving them some privacy from each other, sort of slung down the middle of the room. And I thought this obviously is a big job of work to sort out, and I'm not sure how you do it.
It's a massive issue, and we're talking about it constantly. Do you have an idea of how the application process for the bursary will sort of be managed, or in your mind, the criteria of the kind of ideal recipient of the bursary where does that come in?
Do you know what? I'm sort of in the university's hands on that. They have lots of. I talked to Joel about this, my friend who did the law one, and I asked exactly that question, and he gave me the same answer I'm giving you, which is that the university is very tooled up with working out how you zero in on the students who are the intended targets of the bursary. So I'm sure there's all kinds of ways of doing it. I better not get into that because I will mess it up.
No problem at all. We'll speak to the university about that one. Jeremy, thank you so much for coming on Durham OnAir. It's really, really great. And when people such as yourself who have got a history with the city come back to kind of, we always say in this business, if you can climb up the ladder, make sure you're sticking your hand down to help someone and bring them up. And it's great that you're doing that for Durham University students. And thanks for coming and spending your time on Durham OnAir.
Thanks, Sam. I love your city. Thanks so much.
Eligible applicants will be able to apply for the scholarship for the 2024-2025 academic year, and further details will be available on the Durham University website from this autumn.